can't take away the fact that I'm comrades were in crisis, serious crisis. No. First, the resolution 1 of 2018 has not been issued. Yesterday, we reached a deadline. Government wants to take our pay progression to pay us. For the next 3 years. Last night at the bargaining room, and since prior to that is announcing, addressing the country. That workers of South Africa are too spoiled, they're complaining, they're crying babies. They don't understand the economic reality. And we are watching, we are quiet, we are doing it. There is no alternative to send. And that becomes real to South African society. Because we are trapped. And in most cases, we don't have even to be divided communities along ideology. We're a class. We're exploited. That should have united us more than ever before. But it will remain the same while the employer is advancing. So we are owed, and we are told we are not going to pay what you are owing. In fact, we are not going to pay you what will be due in future. But we are not. We remain far apart each other, even now. So the call from the dollar that we made is that the unity of workers is paramount. There is more that unites us than what divides us. By the way, ideologically, what divides us? And I want to argue here. I'm arguing strongly. There's nothing that divides the working class. So that's a challenge, perhaps, that the workshop must look into. And what are the immediate program to take us forward? And unfortunately, we are no longer having a vanguard that orientates, that mobilizes us around our revolutionary theory. Where I get salary, we said we're not going to move to it. We're not going to move the money class formation. We want the vanguard to fucking cover Sunday. And we can't be complete, and I want you, we can't be a vanguard as trade unions, given our reformist stage. But we can put pressure to all those who claim to be vanguard of the working class to play their role of being a vanguard. By participating in their program, in their campaigns, but also taking leadership. But the problem in a capitalist society, once assume responsibility, you get swallowed. I'm talking to the minister today. Not going to change. In fact, in fact, as the last point, the last point that I'm going to make and sit down at the risk as well. Let's look at South Africa in 1994 today. The most vicious people who have undermined and reversed the work of the working class and trade unions are product of trade unions and the we're in trouble with state ownership enterprise precisely because of those who were called capitalists. So the immediate challenge is that how do we go back to the 1814 call of unity? Because the 1814 says workers of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but the church. How do we do that? And this prevailing moment, and the combination of the capitalist crisis with the COVID presents an opportunity of alternative to capitalism. But we were found at the weakest. And this crisis combined confirm one thing: the inability of capitalism to sustain itself, both structural and systematic. Yet the world calls for the alternative. Where is the working class? So that's a task of the dollar that we think that we must struggle to respond to. Where is the working class? To what an extent do we localize the working class around this revolutionary theory to appreciate task of the moment because there is no class that pities the other. We are on our own. Generally in South Africa, look, comrades, how the working class is used, is always abused in the ANC. Workers in the ANC are trapped in factions.
Yeah.
Sando in the state is an enemy of workers. But in the ANC is a hero because we're factional. Why would ANC keep quiet when its government is not giving workers yet who are members of the ANC and who are pillars that kept the ANC surviving?
Why?
Because we tend to say, I take off my cap of being a worker. And if you take off the cap of being a worker, what do you become? A worker is a worker. Communists, they say, because they happen to be a branch chairperson of the ANC, they say when they speak, I'm taking off my cap of being a communist. If you take it, what do you become? And we understood, comrades, we understood from a Soviet politics between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks that you remain a communist wherever you are. You act as such. Because if you take it, and you are told that some communists who are ministers, once you attack them, you attack communists. It can't be true. Once we are in a state, particularly in a capitalist society, you act and organize on behalf of capital. There is no two ways about it. So that's a reality, that we do think that the immediate task and the immediate solution to all what I have said is to venture into a class struggle. But you will not do so if you don't mobilize and orientate your membership first and foremost around its revolutionary tune. And we must not get tired, comrade. We must take upon ourselves to educate, to empower our members, including us as leaders. Because sometimes we tend to be knowing everything, yet we know nothing. So this is a revolution. Concrete conditions and our experiences, comrade, must teach us in terms of our move forward. Amanda.
Yes, of time. Because I know that you are following the general sector of time. We'll see, of course, before you leave. Yes, we'll just take a few 5 questions. But before we take those few questions, I want you to note these few commitments we want to make to you. Last night, I think we slept at 3. No, where there's not 20, there's no sleeping.
Really?
And there was an additional school yesterday.
Oh, you were together with them?
Yeah.
I was looking for them.
But I think what the commitment we want to make, comrade the General Secretary, is that I guess when the day ends of this conference, we'll be members of WAPT. And that is informed by the ideological perspective. That is informed by the ideological perspective of WAPT against I2. And we can also promise you that we also want to do what you are talking about, the unit of COSATU and SAFTU. But in this case, we want to do it from below. We have a view that this cannot be done by Vavencharinjan because of their egos. Our view is that this can be done by us and you. We want to promise that given all the instruments, the year ends by next year, by December, we would have recruited more than plus 300,000 workers, which would then become part of that fold of Nehal, which is uniting the public sector in the country. By the way, I think I was discussing with the president last week on Saturday in Umtata, and the point I was raising to him was that we have not yet realized the vision of Nehal, because Nehal is national education, health, and allied workers. And I said to him that the vision of Nehal was that it's national education, means all education workers, teachers and everything in Nehal. Yeah. Then health workers, all of them in the country, and allied, meaning that the safety and security sector, the local government, the administration workers, all of them in one union. When we started to attend the National Congress of COSATU, those who were there by that time, I know that with you were still not there. I'm sure you're not in the The fight between Slovo and Tulas, always. Slovo was not talking to Tulas in the Congress, was always coming and said, I'm John, I want Slovo. And of course, he pointed, I said to Slovo, Tulas, you're not supposed to be SADU. SADU was supposed to be the project of the heart. You're supposed to be here in this delegation. That was a fight. And we think time has come now to realize that vision which we established was to make one public sector union, probably with five chapters: education, health, administration, safety and security, local government. But I think one test we have to deal with, which we have raised now, we have to deal that workers seem not to have a political home in the country, given the crisis. And the question is that how do you build what is there? Maybe we talk about swelling the ranks, but with the most conscious cadres, and build the movement, and build the vanguard, and build the trade union movement. I think those are the questions which I think we have to deal with. And I think the important question, as we have said, it means if we are the members of WAFTU to be opportunistic, not as a general sector of NEHAU, but as a general sector of WAFTU. One weapon we want as Salipso is to just get the organizational rights just to remove this agency fee. Because we know that if you remove that agency fee, we know that the teachers, majority of them in this province, in Eastern Cape, they want to join us. Police want to join us, but they can't because there's agency fee, which is caused by the fact that it's closed in the bargaining chamber because of the thresholds. And when I left President on Saturday last week in Umtata, he then asked me, Ndola, what then do you think is the first phase? I said to him, the first phase, we must go, you put us as a joint, as Labor Relation Act with NEHAU, we get into one chamber. If you get one, where there's a small chamber, it's general, if you put us there, all the agency fees have fallen in all the chambers. Then we can promise you we can do it. Then we therefore, he said that unfortunate part which is necessary, we are going to destroy SAT, destroy Propo. I said that attention necessary if it's for the unit of the workers. That's what I think we can do. We want to do or try. And he asked me what then is the second phase. That the second phase is therefore to form a united public sector union in the country. And I said the third phase is to use that weapon to establish a political home of workers in the vanguard from the grassroots and deal who are this advanced detachment of workers. That's what we would commit to you as we're here in this. We have taken people who are serious across the country to deal with this question. I think those are the commitments. We can take 5 questions. One, 2, 3, 4. The last one. Jihad, I know you want to speak. If you don't have an issue, you'll say they've taken 5. Yeah, the last one. Yeah, that's the last one. Question. Okay. Comrade, I'm in charge. Number 1 must ask a question.
Yeah. Thanks, comrade. Good morning, comrade. Yeah.
Morning.
Firstly, I want to thank the General Secretary of Salipso for leading us into this journey. Yesterday, when we spoke to each other, I didn't understand what he was talking about. And I had a lot of questions yesterday. But yesterday, he gave an overview. And I listened yesterday. And I'm listening today again. And what you just said about the class contradictions in terms of fighting each other, because that is what is actually happening on the ground. You belong to Salipso, you belong to SATU, you belong to NEHAU, you belong to all these unions, but people are looking at each other as enemies. And that is the first point of departure. How are we going to actually do this unity? When we have members of NEHAU, when we have members of SAT, when we have members of all these people that are crushing each other, and they are looking at us as enemies.
Come to a question.
The question is, there's a lot of questions, but I'll ask one question. How do we actually do this unit of the working class? Out of this class contradiction.
And I think you must, all other questions will deal with in discussion, even if it's not there.
There's a lot,
Other questions will be responded by Macho.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson. Yes, I hear the General Secretary of the WAFTU, Nehao. General Secretary, I want to come straight to you. I'm a former member of Nehao. I don't have a problem on that. But you are saying we must take our egos out and form the Workers United. But you found that the people who doesn't want that is those they have Amanda, like Nehau, like Satu. You see. And then how can we achieve your vision? Like on straight we apple that is the corner. You see, you see, how can we achieve? And ndiyacela hlekazi ukuthi awuphuma apha kule nkonzo inga ungasinika andifuna ukuthi ufuna isiqinisekiso sokuthi you will work because usemandleni, you will work to make sure that abasebenzi be-public sector bababayiwa.
Strong one. Thanks, Comrade Chair, and thanks to the Comrade GS for excellent input. I have a comment rather than a question, Comrade, if it's permissible. Thank you. So, Comrade GS, it's unfortunate that you're not going to be here today because I thought the input that you made brought up some important points that you would like to take further, particularly besides the complete agreement about the need for the uniting of the public sector and a political fight. There's a point that you were making about the shift in investments from manufacturing to the financial economy and the growth in speculative investment. Now, as AIDC, we've been making an argument for some time now that the public sector unions and public sector workers actually can have a powerful say in some aspect of this, not in all aspects of this. And this relates strongly to the issue of the government employees pension fund. Now, here we see that, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, there's 1.8 trillion rand in accumulated reserves. Most of this is under the asset management of the Public Investment Corporation. Most public servants, most pension funds is managed by this thing. 60% of the investments of the Public Investment Corporation, most of which 80, almost 90% comes from the GPF, is invested in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. That is the financial economy. That is where speculative investments is partly taking place, but not only, but partly. So, as unionists, what are you saying about this, comrades? Why are we not saying use this money to invest in the strengthening of the public sector and a redistributive macroeconomic program? Now, how I hear what you're saying, and WAFTU and Zalipsu and everyone here is saying the ANC can have more say. But I think the ANC is not going to move unless workers are going to say something. So that's my challenge, comrades, and we'll obviously talk about this more in detail later.
Number 4.
Thank you, Comrade Stofile. Leader, you have said a lot of things this morning which are very crucial. But I wanted to allude to the fact that you noted the crumbling down of the unions, meaning the unions are becoming weaker on a daily basis because of the issues like factions and all that. At your position, what do you think should be done to rebuild the unions and capacitate the members of the unions to deal with modern times and the modern challenges that are emanating on a daily basis? Let's relate, for example, issue of COVID-19 that it's a world issue now. What do we do as unions to capacitate our own members to understand what to do to deal with this issue, with this pandemic that we are facing? Because I want to believe it's not only on the vaccination that we have to capacitate our members, but it is beyond vaccination that we need to bring to our members. Capacity building, I think, is the biggest problem in unions, and how to address it as leadership. Thank you.
If you have something, fine. But if you don't have, you're still a comment. There's still a comment. Comment,
So on the first topic, in June last year, as now we launched our campaign on the COVID. We went to hospital at level 5. We're the only union in this country. And then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, I got infected by COVID. But the entire national office bearers of now were in these 4 epicenters: Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, and Gauteng. We produced a report, and I invited yes, Comrade Kumbuzo, the head of Secretariat of NIA, was here. Let's share our fact-finding mission report. We have shared with the World Health Organization, we have shared with the ILO. It's on public domain. We have announced the findings, but we still remain alone. Instead, we are competing in COSATU because of membership.
Serious.
And we are competing outside COSATU. And yet a report brings us to where? Because all these employees in the health sector belongs to all these unions. We miss the moment of saying our members are dying. Can't we ignore everything else and be united in defense of it? That's why companies are not going to be taken serious. That's why people are going to take money meant for PPEs and child. Because we are extremely weak. We are more focused. Our focus is more about us, not about the cause. So unless we appreciate that, and there's no individual who's going to do so, it takes all of us to appreciate why we're in these positions. Because we're not in this position because we're ugly or because we're loved. Because we decided to fight against exploitation. That's why we have trade unions. Until we realize. But as long as we are preoccupied by who must lead and I want to lead, we are not going to make sense. Yeah. And that's a real thing that I want. That's how I want to respond to COVID. And the COVID completely exposed many things. One of the things are the neoliberal policies, cutting social spending. It exposes the kind of a healthcare sector system we have, and education system. We don't have it in this country. If it in the world, but it could have in a capitalist societies. And we need alternative to that neoliberal policy. And the solution for us is to venture into a class struggle as a class. So that's how I want to respond, but we'll share this. GPF, look, Comrade Dollar was appointed to be in the PIC. I never attended, I declined immediately. When Tito said Zola was going to be there, the following day, I sent a letter of resignation. And then I was asked, how do you resign without being even inaugurated? I said, because you had announced me without consulting me. But precisely because I understood what would be the focus of that board, which is not really the focus of what is meant to do. It's taking money to give it to capitalists to make more savings in a form of profit. The only thing that it does, it takes our money and build what is called modes. It's form of a development. Modes are not developments. And GPF largely has representation of trade unions. But what impact are they making? No, comrade, you can be, all of us, look, you can have one person from a business and 9 from a trade union. There will be no change.
Yeah.
The system dictates how we think and how we respond. And some of the things, GPF was our demand, by the way. But look who's running it. So our presence is to just legitimize wrong decisions. And I don't want to be part of legitimizing decisions. That's why I designed PLC, because I knew there will be no impact.
Take it back, take it back.
So the issue is, there are proposals now, for instance, public sector unions, as part of Resolution 1 of 2018, they have said that redirect our pension, let's have housing. So the issue of the government housing employee scheme is meant to be financed. So we're fighting now. Having agreed, the resolution is quite clear, but what the minister did was to take the resources to be led by home loans, not to be administered and be under the control of GPI. The Communist Party is making that call. Let's benefit out of our investment. That's a call.
Yes.
But we're weak, comrade. I can tell you, we can speak English, we're extremely weak as trade unions.
Yes.
I can tell you, there is no strong union in South Africa. Relative speaking. So GPF is a way to go, but as long as we're not united, we will disagree even on things that we're supposed to be agreeing. And capital are capitalizing. Because the most beneficiaries out of our pension fund are there. So we're making that call ourselves. And hopefully, as part of the discussion, you will deal with that. The second question, comrade, you don't need my view, because it doesn't matter, it's immaterial. These are the instruments, comrades, of the masses and the poor in particular, which are in the form of workers. So it doesn't matter. What we need is our consolidated view that matters. Because mina manje, mina to view, as I experience exploitation, you could yes. I go to meetings and choose whether I go or not. So it doesn't matter. What matters is the view of the owners of this instrument, workers. Sometimes we fall in the trap, so you must avoid to make it your own instrument. And it's not the right and entitlement to where we are. The key issue, let the workers determine their destiny and then lead them towards that.
Yes.
If you are not, be removed. Don't regard this as a job.
Okay.
I'm not saying you are, but it is. You are being paid more than you, by the way. Under Patalone now, there's no doubt. So the issue is that the prevailing material conditions must dictate how we think and how we do things, not our wishes. We are in a capitalist society who are exploited. It must be that exploitation that determines how we must then respond to it. So the wishes are not working. Concrete conditions are the ones. So the solution is that one, in fact, when Dollar was in Kossat, was making a lot of noise about the public said, in fact, it was problematic. Dollar.
Oh.
Because was the president. So if Sarah Nance, the president, was a system and so would I be a president? Okay. Let's say now how Salisu must merge. It can't be merged. You'll be swallowed by the because of his size. I will tell Dollar you can't bring so many and then think that you're going to change. He will say no, I can't be a deputy. So some of the issues depends on our wishes. Let workers make that determination. That's why it must be mobilized, must be organized, must be capacitated, must be orientated, so that we don't have choice as individuals. We do what is right. There's no dispute about it. It has been the resolution of Kossat. How at some point we will remember we were to come back later to SAD, but first we were given a project to match with SAMU. We developed constitution, all the things. We were ready to go to a conference. Then SAMU says, says we can't match with that is financial problem. So we are just following. Then we ran away. So the problem is that difficult is that unions historically that they've been there are producing other unions. By the way, SAD arises from Nehao. SAD teachers. Most of the teachers were members of Nehao. When Nehao was born in 1987, you know when SAD was. That man, before he became a provincial secretary of SAD in 2010, secretary KK was a member of Nehao, and he admits that. So the comrade stands there and says I was a member of Nehao. That comrade, he says I was a member of Nisin. There's a reason why he left Nehao. And in the process of allowing the reproduction of tribunals, we open up competition. When you are not happy, you go here. Or when you are sidelined or expelled, you establish yours. No, that's true because because we're so vicious as leaders. We're so vicious. Even the Funundora, I follow him, even in employment and so forth. I take him down to the drain. It can't be correct. So these things are many forms, there are many reasons, lousy reasons that make us to be producing instead of coming to end. Because of the level of consciousness. There's no solution for the working class except its level of consciousness to venture into a revolution to liberate itself. So that's a solution for me. Resolutions are taken in Congress. One public sector unions. We are saying that it's not new. It's been there. And I do think that we'll leave it. The new generation will continue to do that because of the level of consciousness. Things are about us, not about the revolution. So that's a real thing for me. And the issue of egos for me. No. We're elected by leaders, but we're elected by members, but we become above them. They become stupid. And everything else about them, it depends on how we feel. Let's deal with this. When we had a joint, COSATU and SAFTU had a joint action last year, I made this announcement in the president of stop egos. Conditions they dictate that to be one, we must be united. And I'm saying so. But we will not appreciate that if our level of consciousness is where it is. It's needed more than ever before. That's my issue. The last point, Comrade Dollar, on your commitment. And I want to leave you in that context of building the movement. Is it worth it to build a multi-class formation? Personal, and I'm open and I'm arguing wherever I am. We must not waste our time to build a multi-class formation. It doesn't help. It manages contradictions. The contradiction must not be managed because they are inconcilable and antagonistic. What we need is a suppression of one class by the other. And if that is true, then let's build our own working class instrument to venture into a class struggle, overthrow. We don't have time for ANC now. ANC care less about us.
Yeah.
Even now they are preoccupied by looting. We're clapping hands for the looters. Others say Syrian, others say yes. Both of them are the same. Even when you go to elect, you choose a devil. You normally say it's better, but the devil is a devil. Look at the party now. They can't speak because they're given positions. So we must just tell the party, go out of government. Let's build a popular left front to mobilize and build consciousness for the revolution. Amanda.
What do you want to say?
No. Thank you, Cheers. Just a second. I want your view because where I'm sitting, in our involvement as Salipsu, the federation that we belong to. I've got. I just want your thinking, your wisdom about this neglect thing. I've got a problem because neglect is more of business people who are managing unions. So what is your view? Because I believe that the neglect is becoming a weakest link, especially towards the poor working class. So what is it that we can do? Because I can see that everything, even our rights, are reduced to neglect. So what is your input, what is your wisdom in terms of liberating us? Because I think that we are more trapped in business, and business is dictating for unions or federations to go its way, and it's affecting us as workers. So I just wanted your wisdom in regards to that.
As long as comrades you postpone the real revolution, you are going to get it. Because neglect, structures like neglect are to manage contradictions, not to help to resolve. Okay? So we will never win a revolution through such structures, including your bargaining, by the way. In a real revolution of the working class, bargaining is delaying the real revolution. You claim to be demanding, yet you are begging. So for me, it's not a real revolution because you say you demand 15%, yet you know that you want 3%. And you don't even have a capacity to fight for that 15%. You get worried that if I fight for this 15%, they will deduct. Yeah, that's a revolution inherently is violent and there are casualties in the revolution. But bargaining, members who mobilize their heart, but you go there, it can't be correct. We advocated in COSATU last Congress, the unity of workers. We said we must start by going back to NUMSA. As Neha, we were seconded. We are talking to NUMSA even now. We have to, we process, surgical removal, anyhow, I was part, in fact, I implement. So we have a responsibility to come. We will come to Dora as well and others to say this is not a solution to our plight. We will never win. We will never make sense in society if we are far apart from each other. So we have to come.
And I think we have now the clear agenda. That agenda will be engaged as we move on. All the nitty-gritties and the details are fine. Let's just get tea for 10 minutes and come back as I'm taking it out.
Comrade, Magatroy Nene asked online on your way to airport if you still want to ask.
Okay. I was online.
So capture yonke le streama ku YouTube uyasinceda nakwele minutes ne resolution yebo ba uzahamba ne ndihamba ngomsebenzi but since ba uzaba khona yonke le minutes so it will be capture yonke le minutes
so ubona ngoku dia streama
bathi bayivula kwalapha kuba lapha ofika
ndivula ngoku uyivulela ntoni kodwa lapha wena nithama sijoin
so ubona ngoku ufune internet wherever you are kai camera yam don't know akwazi uyiphikisha apha
oh into indivula inceda into esifana ne-minutes yonke loo nto into nemprovider don't have to do that.
Minute taking, as important as it is, it shouldn't become like,
It shouldn't become a burden.
it should be easy enough. It should be something that you are saying, just capture it
As a policy, we are
the majority of
it.
it.
Yeah.
No,
I think you're not part of it. So I'm a full, especially on the laptop. Yeah.
yes.
You're not going to say, yes, I'm a pro. Just I want to do something to look. Can you capture everything you are able to see some of
That's all. And that's the important part.
Yeah.
Nam declare yokubamba.
Yes, but something has stayed then. Again. Hey, kapan kau baca si Rumi, man. Ah, bos parah, dah dah mana mana kau sahaja apa ni doi.
I'm a local. Tata.
Uthi nefoni yakwazi ukubhala.
Yes, yabona ngoku. Jonga Rumi yakho.
Uyajonga.
Yeah, because kumfana Orlando uzofaka in lines.
Kwakho ekhaya.
Yes. Bona i-lines zami zi-on. Zicela bona kufuneka i-account yakho le kaZoom. Bona i-light yami. Yabona isarobhile i-camera. Ubuye nekweli cala. Awasusa namashiti because bendisebenzisile i-blinds nazo zebana yabona i-phone. Yeah, uzosifaka this. That's why the camera is switch on.
Yeah, to be lost.
Are you
And you
gonna?
think I've done welcome? Look at this.
Yeah, you've done well. Man.
Yeah, right?
You've been working very hard. Sit here. No long move now. You can sit here if you want. Sit here. Now anybody can just join us, whatever the person.
From that YouTube channel. Yeah. That's so cool, eh? And it will also mean that we have the recording of this. So
Yes,
we
God
can keep
is
it.
taking everything.
So we will have a recording of all of this. Because of that. Amazing.
You're going to sit here.
So zonke has isolated lights zam. Each light might be controlled by a separate light. Yes.
You don't time us to begin.
But so now currently is another time.
Do we have co-keepers for this?
So
Yeah.
Dominic.
7
Hey,
o'clock in the evening, the lights go
Are
on.
you?
11 o'clock
I'm still.
lights go off.
I'm
And they go on
fine.
again at 5
So
p.m.
I
It's
am
6:30.
logging in on someone else's computer because I'm still finishing my.
Nobody got it.
So
So
I'm
now,
going to start.
so there's a local smart, so these are the conditions. On
3
and off.
minutes max. Okay. And then we can just make sure everything is working.
So quite exactly condition. And it's a condition of an hour.
Alright. Thank you.
This time every morning, this lights must all go. So don't forget that
Are you connected?
that's an alpha. Lights are on. So the material color in lights is so again
Oh shit. I made a mistake.
So do mamele kwacha. Manje ifuna inatsika le.
Actually, this is how I control them. And then the
Ah,
arms.
Shabuma!
Going on? Okay.
Man sipho ngoba.
Can I leave you now? Yes.
Yeah,
This is outside.
Orange up. Wenzani? Ngila uze ubhizi yabaleka. Yintoni ngawubaleka? Ngila
No, but
Ngila.
actually, what do you think was sign on a form?
Yatho. Tata. Ulibonisa le nto ulwati yokwenza
So here, good morning to you colleagues. I trust
We'll deal with
well.
processes. We'll deal with them. What are the deal?
So WhatsApp emails, you want to type out your document, whatever you want. You don't use you're gonna catch
Are you winning?
You see, Dick, the tactic here, when we get to one national, the regional, special practice site of now we're going to join affiliated because the supplement just paid 2,000 for the whole year. They're not doing that. You have to, it's going to instruct me how, which instructs on who's the center of who have to interact. But also a center of the how. That go and work with the
minutes.
so
Let's just get the
inside that
on.
of labor relation act.
As soon as she's on, we can.
So that we get into partnership, we remove the agency fee, and therefore get subscription.
agency fee?
Agency fees that if you are not in the bargaining chamber, there's a man who paid, means you pay twice, you pay your subscription to the union, and you say an amount different that you're not in the bargaining chamber. It's then the labor relation act, I think section 18. So they're stopping that because now we're not getting the
Because you are too small, you are below
they've
the
increased,
threshold.
they've increased the threshold to 60,000. So we're too small, cannot get in there.
How many members are you now? Like 10,000?
We're 10,000 we're growing, but after that they stop with the subscription and we start growing the profit. So once we work with them, we get those occasional rights, then we actually destroy pork. I think the how can tell you that in the how can be together now can actually be 700,000 workers. Then we build structures from the one to national. Then we begin to talk about the working class movement against the ANC. then we stand.
But I mean, one thing I was saying to the other comrade, one thing I missed in the General Secretary, very interesting speech, when I especially picked up it was a popular restaurant and so on. But I mean, they should appeal to the Communist Party and to the COSATU. You must leave the alliance because I think that is the historical break that must.
But Dick, in order to do that, we've been saying that once we're there. Now the question is that we're going to use this public sector, big producer across we form ourselves that here, we form ourselves kind of the vanguard. They will understand them that they become irrelevant because they will be now a massive with power working class movement.
And you have to contest for government.
Yeah. Because if we're public sector workers, our solution would come politically from those who are elected.
Oh, it's a very difficult situation. And,
that's a strategy.
Look at Blake's demand and how he's squeezed by the students.
Even COSATU is solid.
They came out and they will support the ANC in the elections.
They've become now the deployment commission.
I can hear you.
Because they are used to deploy themselves to parliament. Let me just take it. Should I bring you those tobacco?
Yeah, no, not necessary now.
Okay, fine. Okay.
Can you hear us, Musi? You can't hear us. Oh no. I wonder what's going on. Yeah, we can see you. And if you speak, are you muted? Oh, we can read you this. I just want to. Say again, Lucy? Yeah.
Just curious about the audio.
Sure.
Is it not working?
It's just quite slow. We heard Lucy and Soa from here. If
Yeah.
push comes to shove, that will work.
What is your phone?
Oh,
To charge the Type-C.
yeah.
What did you use my phone? Then I'll just connect it directly to the
But let's see if this works. Let's see if this doesn't work, we do that.
Okay. Audio-wise, how do you get your voice there? Audio.
Oh, that is the problem. Our audio jack is the problem. Our audio jack works here. I mean, there's a aux cable here, but my aux slot is. That's HDMI.
Is the internet too slow, or what is the problem?
The computer's slow, but I think it's gonna work now.
I have a fast computer.
I'm telling you, I think it's a problem.
You can try my
Yakarazi moto.
When you're finished, may I call them to come in?
Yeah.
Testing audio, can you hear us?
Comrades, just get in line.
Testing, testing.
One year. Hey, can you hear us? You can't hear us.
Can you hear us now?
Can you hear now? No.
Testing.
Right. So you still can't hear us, I'm guessing. Can you speak in English? Now we can't hear you. Nick, please bring your laptop.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll try another laptop. So sorry.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hey.
Zokutshintsha leyo malikhizana nantuka banga. Comrade Jabu. Iyafuneka ngaphakathi.
So sorry.
Are we winning?
Trying to see this.
Oh, you checked every side. Well, the problem with my PC.
Sorry, I started the meeting with the other laptop and started with the new one. Can you rejoin again?
Must we switch off lights? Can we do that? Yeah, we will.
My son and my grandson.
That one.
My son to the right and my grandson to the left.
Oh.
Can you ask him
How about it?
This is kind of 3 years ago in Sweden. We were visiting.
Now we can you see the audio with your
He is 5 months South Africa. Yeah, he's younger than that one. So he's the uncle of that one. And that is how life can be. This one is not exactly well. I'm sorry. And on your side. Yeah, he's more like this is your it's my grandson is the long one. Axel is my son in South Africa. This one, yeah. A portrait category color. No, she's the spokesperson of Crisis Committee. Wow. And this one is here in South Africa as well. No, he's in Sweden. This is my grandson in Sweden. Yeah, the son of my daughter in Sweden. Do you often go to Sweden? Yeah, but now because of COVID, I haven't been in Sweden for 1.5 years. So I was there, then once every year I try to go, but yeah, right of COVID. I don't know about Swedish news now, but France, for example, if you go from South Africa,
Okay, I'm speaking now. Can you hear me?
yes,
I just see Dominic's excited.
Yes, we accepted.
Dominic is ready. Yeah, I'm just gonna share my slides. Maybe after I say hi, I'll do my slides. Yes, I can hear you. Okay.
And also, before you share your slides, maybe people can see your face.
Okay, sounds good.
Alright. Amandla!
Away to!
Away to! Amandla! Forward to the public sector workers, forward!
Forward!
Down with the tax on the public sector workers!
Down!
Comrades, I'm quite pleased and excited to introduce Busi Sadeko.
That's right.
She works at the Institute for Economic Justice and is also the chair, one of the chairs of the Budget Justice Coalition, of the steering committee of the Budget Justice Coalition. And she's done quite a lot of research work and popular education on the government's austerity budget, the budget cuts that has been unfolding. And so, as we go, we think that the tax of the public sector is not divorced from government's broader, but Busi can't see us now. The broader government's austerity agenda cannot be the public sector work. A tax can't be disconnected from government's broader austerity agenda. So before we get into the details about what's happening in the public sector, we're going to ask Busi to speak for 20 to 25 minutes and map out what's currently happening in terms of government's economic policies. Okay, and then from there we can engage in discussion and questions. And we're really grateful for Busi joining us today. So really thanks a lot, Busi. And if you want to add anything to the introduction, you're welcome. And then I hand over to you.
No. Thank you for having me here. Good morning. It's always good to be in these spaces. It's it's the work that we do. It doesn't help for us to sit and do the economic research and not share it with the people who need it, right, to use that information. So thank you for inviting me to your space, and I hope I'll say some things that are, interesting and worthwhile for you. So I'll just start my presentation. Here. Okay, hopefully the full slide will go. All right, so as Dominic already said, my name is Busi Sadeko and I'm a researcher and budget policy lead at the Institute for Economic Justice. And yeah, I'll just start from here. So where do we begin? I always think it's very important that we start before COVID. This budget is not sudden. It is a built up from what has been happening for the last 5 years and longer, because longer in a sense that we are within an economic paradigm of neoliberalism, and one that perpetuates or reproduces racial capitalism and patriarchy. And so it's important to locate it within that larger context, but also to say fiscal policy in South Africa over the last 5 years has been very conservative, more conservative than we've seen probably in the past. So what was happening pre-COVID? So we see here on your, I'm not sure if it'll be on your left, but I think you can see my mouse. I don't know if it's your left or right. But on this graph, the main budget revenue and spending. This is the infamous hippo that Minister Tito Mboweni talks about, right? Like the hippo's mouth is opening here, and so forth. So you can see there that expenditure has grown, right? And you know, everyone is like, that's bad because revenue is low. But the more interesting graph is the one here, which is the revenue and non-interest spend. And when we talk about non-interest spend, we are talking about spend on everything but debt. So excluding debt servicing costs. This is what we spend on education, on health, on our departments, on government spend, basically, right? And so when you look at this graph, then you have a different story, because then you don't have a hippo's mouth, right? Like when we see there at the end. You can see, and I know that maybe you might not see the colors well, but the top line is the in-budget non-interest spending, and the bottom line is the revenue. So you can see that it's getting thinner. It's getting thinner. So what does that mean? It means, this is what it actually translates to. Debt servicing costs have been the fastest growing expenditure on our budget list, right? And this is not necessarily to say we mustn't pay our debt services, right? We have to pay our debt servicing costs, but it's just to give you a view of actually what's happening when that hippo's mouth is supposedly increasing. It just means a larger share of expenditure is going where? To debt servicing costs. And so there you see that goods and services and compensation of employees, there you see it. So CPI inflation is here. So this would be the real increase. When you look on the side of the graph, this would be the real increase in how much we're actually spending on that. So we argue that over the last 5 years, there's been austerity in South Africa. There's been multiple indicators besides this non-interest, the first one being the non-interest expenditure change, right? And I'm hoping that we've already gone through the definition of austerity, but I'll just repeat it to say that austerity is budget cuts or regressive taxes, which means taxes that disproportionately impact the poor. And importantly, it has to be during a period of low growth, right? And the reason being to solve debt or growth issues. And this is an important distinction, because fiscal consolidation in a period of growth is fiscal consolidation. But if there's fiscal consolidation during a period of no growth, right, then it's austerity. And that's a very important distinction to make, because government says that there's no austerity because the total debt is increasing. And that is the incorrect definition. That is not what austerity is defined as. And it's important that we challenge that, because our ministers are basically rewriting economics in its entirety. And so it is a false definition to give, to say that if debt to GDP is increasing, therefore there's no austerity. Because austerity is defined, like I said, by budget cuts or regressive taxes during a period of low growth to resolve debt and economic growth issues, which is all that's happening in South Africa currently, right? So between 2016-17 and 2018-19, the increase in average non-expenditure, right, was below population growth, which means per person spend in South Africa has been declining over the period. And that's very important, because one of the indicators of austerity is budget expenditure that is not keeping up with the need, right? The expected increase over time. What we also see is that there was a net increase from 14 to 15% in April of 2018, which is of course a regressive measure, right? It's a regressive tax measure because it disproportionately impacts those with low incomes. It reduces their disposable income. And interestingly, there's this big talk now about let's invest in infrastructure. But actually, when you look at South Africa over the last couple of years, you'll see that the public sector investment in the nation's infrastructure slowed down for consecutive years, right? 2017 and 2018. And this is also another important context that we must consider. Why is it now that infrastructure spend is more important than it was in 2017, 2018? Why was it not a priority then? Why is it now all of a sudden a recovery instrument, right? So the inconsistencies in the rationale have to be challenged and explored, and National Treasury has to explain to us. I mean, if someone asked me, maybe I might have a different answer about what sort of infrastructure we might need. But the point of the matter is this change, this switch from like reducing investment to now increasing or supposedly increasing investment in the current period. And in health, what we've seen is that even though the public sector services 83% of the population, spending per uninsured person has only increased by 1.7% on average. And so this is just like 0.1% over population growth. So it's barely growing. And importantly, we have to understand that in health, for example, the medical price inflation is higher than normal inflation. So in fact, it's probably in real terms reducing. And learner spend as well is another area that is concerning because it's fallen by 8% in real terms between 2010 and 2017. And later on in the slides, I'll go into what's happening going forward. But basically, we've been systematically underfunding or reducing funding in these key areas. Yet we say these are priority areas. In the NDP, the latest review, it's all about education. It's all about human capital. Yet at the same time, these are the trends we see. Right, and then National Treasury explicitly said to us last year and the year before that they were going to reduce the budget by 5, 6, and 7% in the following years. So there was a clear indication that there was austerity going forward, and in fact an accelerated austerity than we had seen before. So that's where we were. And the reason why I start with that context is because we have to understand that going into our rescue package, there was already a logic of austerity. So it's almost like we couldn't expect grand ideas because we know what kind of national treasury we had. We know what kind of national treasury, what they were trying to achieve over the years. And so in a way, it's sort of expected that even though 500 billion was promised, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors because it effectively, in real terms, or real money that was pumped in by National Treasury was about 1%, right? And so that's also an important context because we've got this grand idea of 500 billion. And even though, let's say the 500 billion was actually 500 billion, when we did an assessment in February this year, just before the SONA, we basically realized, sorry about that. Those are my younger siblings making a noise in the background. And so what we effectively found just before the SONA is that only a third of it had been utilized, right? So the reason why we say it's not 500 billion is because for example, the 200 billion for the credit loan guarantee scheme is an off-budget item, right? It's the South African Reserve Bank that is effectively provisioning that facility. It wasn't National Treasury saying here's 200 billion that's going to be utilized. But in addition to that, we know that the National Treasury. So we know that the National Treasury, they are the ones who are going to be liable for it, right? So effectively, if the businesses don't pay back the money, National Treasury, it's basically a liability, which was also a concern that we had raised. In terms of Social Security, we know that there were measures taken for grants, and the extension, or rather so in terms of, let me start that again. In terms of the social grants, we do know that there was a caregiver grant that was provided and then subsequently ended. And the reason why I call it a caregiver grant is because it was per caregiver, it wasn't per child. And that's very important to distinguish because if the child grant was extended to all the children, we would have seen a very different picture in terms of outcomes of poverty and so forth. or rather what families, went through during the period. We also saw the introduction of the 350 grant, which now civil society is calling for it to be extended into a universal basic income grant, and that is very significant and something that should be taken seriously. And we know that 350 rand is not enough, right? It falls below the food poverty line of 585 rand. So what does 350 rand do? So also another important area to consider. And wage relief, also another area that was utilized. So you'll see there on this little part, the used part. That's what happened. And tax relief was provided to businesses, although of course there has to be an assessment of who got the tax relief. Was it small businesses? Was it large businesses? Who was able to actually, be able to get this relief? Although, important to note that it was more deferral. So it wasn't that they don't get to pay tax. It was that it would be deferred into a longer period. In terms of municipalities, that's where it gets tricky, because we know that 20 billion was allocated to municipalities, but because we do not have real life tracking of how municipalities spend money, we actually, at the point which we did this assessment, we could only track about 0.2 billion of the 20 billion that had been allocated. And in terms of health as well, we could locate about 12.5 billion, but of course there's a lot of anecdotal evidence around, issues in that area, and obviously corruption across board being a key thing to consider and to be taken seriously. So overall, the 500 billion that never was, didn't materialize to be in the ways that it should have. And in fact, we argue that there will be no recovery without rescue. If we needed rescue, we still need rescue. The pandemic is not over, and a third wave could be on the horizon. And our government basically has said they've got no intention of providing further relief. And so that's something as well that is concerning going forward. But basically to say that we need to rescue still, we need to rescue, households. We just saw those statistics around KZN and the Cape, that 46% of households were going hungry during this period. And I think that has to be taken seriously, because it means we're on the verge of a humanitarian crisis in the absence of rescue measures, even though our government has decided that we're now in recovery phase. So coming to budget 2021. So what does our government do now that this 500 billion hasn't been utilized, now that they haven't rescued the economy or households or businesses sufficiently? What do? They come back to us with a budget of austerity, and one that entrenches neoliberalism in a very real way. Our government has effectively said, we are going to remove ourselves, and stop crowding out private sector. And we hope that by removing ourselves, private sector will step in. And that's where we are, where government is saying we will not continue with our constitutional obligations to deliver what we have promised. In fact, we're going to be cutting across board the budget, despite the current circumstance that we're in. And at the same time, they've said, we're going to cut the budget, we don't have money. But at the same time, we're also going to reduce taxes for corporates as a proposal, which doesn't make sense. It's inconsistent. Of course, how state money exists, is very complicated. But at the same time, I think it's worthwhile to challenge Treasury on its own logic, which is to say, we need money, we don't have money, yet at the same time, we're going to reduce this, corporate income taxes, which does not make sense. And so, this is where we are in this budget, that is, a neoliberal capitalistic economic model, and it trenches it further. And so the Budget Justice Coalition called for this budget to be rejected because we believed that it was one that would harm the economy, that would harm people, and really was not or could not be compared to what the constitutional obligations were. But of course, we did not get that. But I just have this quote here. It's from a paper I wrote, The Cost Austerity Lessons for South Africa. And just to again to remind everyone, right? Austerity policies have been part of a neoliberal toolkit, which is characterized by stabilization. We are in that moment now. Liberalization, privatization. It will be interesting to see what happens to our state-owned entities now, and you've already heard some of the rhetoric around privatization and rationalization. And rationalization deeply has to do with the public sector wage bill. And this happened a lot in African states under the structural adjustment programs, where they effectively reduced the sizes of, the public health, employees and so forth in those multiple sectors. And so it's interesting now that the bank is saying, we need to spend more because they effectively played a big role, the IMF, in reducing and rationalizing public sector, sectors across the African continent. And in this paradigm, the free market is seen to be the most efficient allocator of resources, and that's what we're seeing currently with the whole proposal of private-public partnerships, blended public finance models, and our infrastructure or private sector-led infrastructure program. And so it's all about states reducing or eliminating their redistributive taxation, and deficit spending, controls on international exchange. Of course, we might not have all of these, but just to give you context of what austerity does. So yeah, austerity's neoliberal dreams come true, and I think we already covered that. And just to say, the private sector-led growth and infrastructure strategy, goes back on what is the role of the state. It is important these days, I like to say to people, we think we're debating policies, but actually what we're debating is the role of the state. If your sense of what the role of the state is very narrow, then you obviously think it is impossible for the state to deliver on many things, right? So if your notions of the role of the state are neoliberal, and you feel that the small state is ideal, then of course your policy prescriptions are going to replicate that. And so it's also important that we do not throw out those ideological debates. They are important. Policy is ideological. And so in this current context, our government is saying, look, we want to attract private sector and we're going to enable private sector to operate. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the risk for private sector, right? So we're going to use South African money, South African people's money. I don't like to call it taxpayer money anymore because people then think there's a certain group of taxpayers, but it's South African people's money, or people living in South Africa's money. And we're going to de-risk, investment by private sector. But the thing is, de-risking means that these projects are going to be liabilities on the public purse. So if the companies default or don't make profits, look at the Gautrain, it means that the government is going to have to pick up that slack. And so it's problematic because traditionally public-private partnerships, by definition, were meant to benefit both parties, right, in a different way from what we see now. Because what has happened over time is that public-private partnerships benefit private sector only, really, because when they make a profit, government is not necessarily going to get an in on that profit per se, in the way that we think. So that's also very concerning in terms of this proposal, because I don't think there's been substantive critique of that. But also important to note that Mr. Mboweni said that he wants user-paid principles. And so what does that look like in a country where more than half the population lives below the upper bound poverty line? Can we afford to pay for a Gautrain? We can't, and that's why the Gautrain is not making profit. What does it mean when we say people, have to pay for services when unemployment is so high, when poverty is so high? And so it's inconsistent again, the vision of what they're trying to do. But again, it goes to this issue of private sector provisioning goods. There are goods that the public sector must provide, and they cannot be provided through the private sector. It just does not work. But again, it's deepening austerity. They've cut budgets for most of us. And I said earlier that what's happening is that they've given tax breaks and so forth to the wealthy. There's higher rebates for people who are wealthier, of course, because those are people who can afford, or middle, even upper middle, I'd say, class and above. People can afford medical aid. People can afford, provident funds. People rebates anyway from those services are the ones who benefit from it, whereas majority of the population can't. Let's say, so I just want to show you this graph here. This is what's happening to spend per person in South Africa. So you can see there, starts at 2012. So it increases, but like marginally, very little, right? And drops. It increases in 2015, 2016. And I think that's where you can begin to see the real drop over time, right? From there, 2015, 2016, you go all the way to 2018, 2019. The only reason it increases here is just because of COVID expenditure, right? That extra 36 billion on the budget, as a new expenditure makes it go up quite a bit. But you see over the next 3 years what's going to happen. We're going to be spending in 2022-3 less on per person than what we spent in 2012, 2013. That's what's going to happen over the next 3 years. So when it comes to health, so it's interesting because we're in a health pandemic and our government is supposed to obviously be investing more. We've seen that our health system really needs the resources. I mean, there's a tech report from 2018 that said that there were 38,000 vacant posts in healthcare. And so, clearly there's a lot of investment that needs to be made into our healthcare system. But what's actually happening over the next 3 years is that the government is going to cut health expenditure by 50.3 billion. So yes, there's allocations being made for the vaccine, but at the same time, when we look at the net effect, what is happening, there's a net loss to the health sector. And I've already said that prior to COVID, we'd already been spending barely enough, in terms of increasing expenditure per person. So that's only going to get worse. And what does that mean? It means longer lines at clinics, it means longer lines at hospitals, it means shortages of medicines, it means, 83% of South Africa's population is going to be impacted by these decisions. In terms of education, also another area where there's deep cuts, and in the next slide I'll show you more the numbers. But what's striking in the budget is that even National Treasury itself acknowledges that these early retirements and compensation bill cuts will reduce the number of available teachers. This, coupled with the rising number of learners, implies larger class sizes, especially in low-fee schools, which is expected to negatively affect learning outcomes. So, in what constitutional world does the National Treasury admit that their cuts will have a negative impact on the right to education, and that budget still passes? So that's something that's really concerning. But I won't go too much into this, but you can see there effectively that the real basic education budget is going to decrease over time there by 13.3 billion rands, and that's an annual rate of negative 5.1%, right? So per learner spend is going to decrease by negative 8.6% because you have to remember population growth as well considered. In terms of social grants, I didn't do the 3-year analysis, but you can see here that there's real cuts even in the current moment. So the changes look positive. These are the nominal changes. But when you take into account the inflation, you can see that actually all the grants in real terms are declining. And of course, again, we know that the grants are ending this week. This is the last month for the 350 Rand grant, the special grant, and also obviously the caregiver grant was ended way longer before. I just want to check how long I've been speaking. Okay, wrapping up now. And so CCMA, I thought this would be an interesting case, one that I've been looking at about CCMA and the austerity cuts. So 100 million budget cut in 2021, and over the next 3 years there's supposed to be more cuts. But of course, CCMA has said in the past that they are already functioning with not enough budget to begin with. And I thought it was interesting because you'll see here there's a report from the Council of Europe which showed that austerity measures reduced labor protection. And so this is a direct attack on labor, right? Besides, I didn't want to talk public sector wage bill because I think you'll talk a lot more about that. But to say that these are one of the avenues in which the public sector, or rather just labor, is being attacked, right? It's undermining or weakening public institutions meant to protect labor. And so South Africa hasn't implemented austerity labor policies per se, labor policies, but this austerity measure in itself, I'd say, is one of the direct attacks on labor policies in a particular way. But this is all part of it, right? One of the tenets of austerity is deregulating the labor market. So this is, classic textbook example. But I just want to say that there's no such thing as pro-growth fiscal consolidation. In itself, it's an oxymoron. This is an austerity budget, no matter what the minister says. And there's many ways in which it is, and we've discussed, and we can discuss further. But the reason why I put this slide is because austerity is such a political decision, there's a reason why the minister feels so strongly that they have to back their decision, or rather to defend themselves against it being austerity, because we know that it's not just a technical process, it is a political process, a political decision that they've made, and so they feel strongly that they have to say it is not. But there's no consensus on debt globally about how much debt is too much debt. There's a lot of studies, and I'll share the slides. You can read them. The studies from the World Bank about the tipping point, which have been, discredited, but there's still no consensus on the issue. So it's not about debt to GDP. A lot of countries have debt to GDP higher than 100%. What it's really about is debt servicing costs. Can we afford to service our debt? And I hate household analogies, but in this case, I'll draw from your house bond. It's not about the total amount, right? Like, although that's determined by how much you earn, but in a national budget, that wouldn't be necessarily the thing. But to say that it's about, can you afford to pay it off over time? And that's what we need to be concerned about. So debt costs require growth, right? It needs economic growth. It needs for us to be able to spend more to service our debt. It means we need to either reduce the cost of borrowing, or we need to grow rapidly to pay our debt, right? And so right now, I would argue that South Africa's debt vulnerabilities are not that high. And in fact, we can service our debt, but what we desperately need is growth in the South African context. As we know, we haven't been growing much. So our debt is largely in rands, which is a bonus, because then the South African Reserve Bank can do more to make borrowing cheaper. The South African Reserve Bank has more tools than another country might have. The current account and reserves, we have reserves in foreign currency, which are healthy, which can help us if needed. Obviously, the debt servicing costs are concerned in a context of no growth, right? That's a fundamental issue. And of course, COVID has disseminated our economy in many ways, and we'll probably be talking about how much scarring our economy has experienced over the last couple of months, for years probably. Economists in 20 years' time will be writing about what was the actual economic impact of COVID on South Africa's economy. And the continued liabilities, SOEs remain a key concern for many reasons, of course, including the risk of privatization. But those remain a key concern because there hasn't really been a proper strategy that has been communicated about how they plan on dealing with them. And I said to someone the other day, I said, it's so funny that in 2019, the reason why we needed austerity was because of Eskom. That is why we needed austerity. But Eskom has fallen off, right? Like in the subsequent budgets, it's like fallen off. But we know Eskom still has their debts, right? And so it's important that we don't forget some of these other critical components outside. And it's not just Eskom, it's all the SOEs that we need to think about in a different way, so that, one, we don't leave them to being privatized, really. But yeah, something we have to deal with. And so, yeah, and also when we talk about debt servicing, or debt in itself, National Treasury has been promising to reduce our debt since 2012. The first time we see fiscal consolidation in the budgets is 2012. It is now almost a decade later, and National Treasury's approach to debt management has failed abysmally, and they're getting away with it. And it's important that we hold them accountable to say, you have failed, yet the failure is being socialized to the rest of South Africans, and not just to all South Africans in the same way, but disproportionately to the poor and working class. And, so we have to really, take them up on that. But I wanted to come back to this cost of borrowing. Look at what South African Reserve Bank was able to do for us last year when they intervened. What they did is that by lowering the repo rate, it helped with public borrowing costs. So why can't SARB do more is fundamentally a question. Why can't we implement non-orthodox, monetary policy tools to reduce our borrowing costs? But before I end, and I know I've probably gone over, I don't know what time we started. I usually try to keep a timer. But before we stop this presentation, I think what I wanted to also bring to you is this idea that yes, we speak a lot about how austerity impacts the working poor, the poor more. But actually, austerity has also a very gendered impact on women, and it's something that we need to talk more about because, as we've seen during COVID, even though the productive sector, right, because there's a dichotomy between the household and the productive sector, which is, I think shouldn't be there to begin with, because households are sites of production and households are sites of social reproduction, right? That's where labor is produced. That's how we are made. For Husi to become, an economist, there is social reproductive work that occurred over time, over my lifetime, to make me who I am, right? And it's largely carried by women. And so what we've seen during this crisis is clearly that even when productive sectors stop functioning, reproductive work continues. Productive work in households has continued, and GDP cannot capture this, right? And what austerity does is that the social reproductive work of recreating labor, of so forth, women rely on social services more, right? Because by virtue of being, the ones who conduct the social reproductive work. And so in a way, neoliberalism assumes social reproductive work to be limitless and productive work within the household to be limitless. And I want to really end here to say that we are in a crisis of social reproduction and production in the household. As unemployment is increasing, we are going to experience a crisis, and austerity is only going to make it worse. And will continue to make it work, right? So austerity and fiscal policies, they hit the vulnerable the most, right? They hit women the most, who are overrepresented and most exposed by virtue of our current racial, capital, and patriarchal system, right? Which works that way. Capitalism is subsidized by women's labor. And I think the reason why I wanted to end here is because sometimes when we talk about these economic issues, there's a tendency to focus a lot on the productive sectors, on that kind of sphere. But to say that what happens when government isn't spending enough on health is that health work is absorbed in the household. So it's important that we link these macro policies to how they infiltrate down to the household, and that to actually also understand the crisis of austerity as a crisis that deeply impacts women in a very particular way. And obviously here on the slide, I've got the evidence from the financial crisis that showed that, the austerity measures that were implemented then really had detrimental impacts on women. And so, it's sort of ending on this idea that when we talk about fiscal policy in general and austerity in general, we have to consider it among racial lines, around gender lines, around class dynamics, around all these intersectional lines, so that we're not having a conversation. And I've started off with the big conversation, but just to end and narrow it down to that particular group. That's the end of my presentation, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Lucy. I think that was comprehensive and excellent overarching analysis of government's macroeconomic framework and the history of it, how it's not new. And so it's on that note that I will ask comrades who would like to comment or ask questions for Lucy. I see one comrade at the back. Yeah. Sorry, just a quick request. When you do make your interventions, you must please come closer to the computer so that Lucy can hear you. So we'll go, comrade with the hat is comrade 1. Comrade Hue.
Yes.
Comrade number 2. Comrade Gordon. Comrade Loati is 3. So Comrade Hue, Comrade Gordon, and then Comrade Loati. and then we'll see if we will take a next round. But we'll start with those three.
Should have stayed here.
This is fine. Let's see who's continuing from here.
Mono says we are live.
Do you hear Busi?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, mute. Yeah.
Okay. Now, thanks for the comprehensive presentation. I've got two, if not three questions regarding the macro policies and the budget 2021. Firstly, the issue on social spending, we are aware that the government has actually cut a lot on that. In your opinion, do you think the 350 grant for the unemployed, it's sustainable with this particular budget that we've been presented with for 2021? Two, recently we had the claim by Esethu Stofile talking about the Heritage Fund. How serious should we take him on that particular thing? Thank you.
Someone else is Busi.
Yeah, Bo.
Yes, it's Busi. Thank you for the presentation, Mara. I need your guidance, especially as the workers. Right now, my belief is that we're talking about the servicing of debt. And while we are talking about the servicing of debt, we are talking about austerity measures where they are cutting education, they are cutting health. And while we are still grappling with that, our government goes out and further get money from IMF. Which is, my problem is that once they go out and get that money, and at the same time the president tells us that he wants an economic growth, how do you begin to get economic growth when it's still borrowing? Because my belief is that when you go to IMF, anything that you get from them, it comes with conditionalities. So it means we are not going to be able to go out of poverty. Actually, we are going deeper because it means in 2010, while we are still servicing the debt, that debt has tripled, while the number of unemployment, the number of poverty, it has tripled also. So my belief is that, do you think anytime soon are we going to go out of that square mile of poverty, of continuous servicing of debt, or are we going to Zimbabwe situation? Because right now I see us going to Zimbabwe and we are being told that there is economic recovery. I don't see it coming. That's the first one. The second one is going to speak to the question of us not getting the wages. Because they said, the minister is talking about cutting the wage pay. But my problem is that he is not cutting their own wage because they are the one who are consuming a lot. To such an extent that out of all of them, even their girlfriends, they get benefits. So the wage bill, it's not more of workers, it's more of the government officials. Because like myself, as an education specialist, I'm getting plus minus 18,000 or so. And then you can't increase my salary, but we've got the sense of who are getting a lot, who are getting all the benefits. So my belief is that why can't we have a situation where even yourself as analysts, as yourself, to advise our government, they say, but you can begin to tamper with your own benefits up there, the bodyguards and so forth. Because my belief is that they are spending billions and billions on bodyguards. And if they can reduce that nonsense, I think we will be able to move to a better society. Because why do you have to have bodyguards that are 6 for who train? When we can have one, futu katelwan. Because they're supposed to do things right so that they can walk freely, we hug them. So we are spending more money on things that they don't better our situation as a country. It's bettering their lives, it's making them comfortable while us, we are being told that there is no money, while at the same time they are stealing. So that is where I am, that's where I'm sitting. And the last one, where did the 500 come from? Because we were given the budget last year. We were told that there's no money. But when COVID came, thieves decided to say, no, we'll get somewhere and be able to raise 500 billion. Why didn't they raise that 500 billion to better our lives as public servants, as the society as a whole? So those are my questions.
Sawubona, madam.
Come on.
Yeah, I think some of the questions I was going to ask, Comrade Maseko have already asked them. I must thank Comrade Dominic for bringing you to us. I'm sure he's going to give us a lot of background behind. Maybe he's going to give us more information about you. Because my question firstly was, do you sit with Peter Mboweni in this budget? But I represent workers in the Western Cape. I'm the provincial secretary, and one of the things that you've mentioned, which I need clarity on, was you said no recovery without a rescue. There was a slide that you mentioned, no recovery without a rescue. How does that relate to us as public service workers? And the second question that the second comment that you also spoke about was on the issue of the public sector wage bill, which were all, as the public service workers, as a representative of workers, need to know, is it true that there is no money in this country? That's what we want to know. And another thing that we also want as workers to know, you also spoke about de-risking. The de-risking versus public sector. So I'm very interested on that one, the de-risking. So those are the three questions that I just wanted to clear up.
Thanks, Comrade. Thanks, Comrade Uwe, Comrade Gordon, and Comrade Zwati. I'll take another round. Can also check how much time Lucy has. She works so hard, she probably needs a little bit of a break on the Saturday. So maybe 20, 30 minutes more at max, Lucy, then we can release you.
Yeah. Should I answer these ones first and then?
Yes, I'm going to ask you to leave the question on the public sector wage bill and if there's money or not. Because we're going to say there's no money. So we must just go home now. No, we're going to deal with that quite extensively. So I'm going to ask you to park that one and deal with the other quite big questions that were asked. Is that okay?
Yeah, so I'll do these ones and then we'll take next round. Sounds good. Thank you for all the questions. The first question around, the issue of social spending and so forth. So that is the 350 Rand sustainable? This is why I actually have a problem with this idea of consumption spending versus investment spending. Because our government would say we are spending on teachers or education and that's consumption spending. But to me, that is an investment, right? You are investing in your labor force for the future, right? So to think of it in a one-minded way, a desk looks like a desk. It's a desk, yes, it's consumption, it's gone, you bought it, it's over. But that desk is enabling learning, which is going to increase your future labor productivity. It's going to have way more rewards. What are the fiscal multipliers? When you spend on something, what are you getting back in your economy in return? It's something we have to think deeply about. And with social grants in our country, there are many studies that have shown that social grants have high multipliers, especially the child grant. Spending on children has a high bang for your buck, is what Americans call it, bang for your buck, right? Because the rewards are higher than what you actually spend. It's 350, yes, it's not enough to begin with. But we have to then track in our economy. We spend 300, if you want to know the value of 350 Rand in our economy, go ask ShopRite, right? That is where people stop. That is where they get the bang for the buck. And then hopefully ShopRite pays their taxes and there's a whole system. So I think it's important that we don't think of social grants as just spend that is lost in our economy. It is spend that has multipliers in many ways. Ask township economies, ask people who work in the informal sector, how these grants effectively sustain them and our township economies. So those are sort of like there's just been a long history of people really speaking badly about welfare and speaking badly about social grants and so forth as sort of like lost money and how people have to work for it and so forth. But I want to take that further. One of my latest theories, or not theories, but one of my latest musings is to say that the reason why we need social grants in our country is fundamentally because we have broken economies. We have a broken economy that is not generating enough jobs, and not only is it not generating enough jobs for people who are able to work, but it's also deeply underpaying the people in this country. There was a study in 2015 or 2016 that said that over 50% of working people in South Africa earn below working poverty line, right? And working poverty line means that they're not earning enough to bring themselves and their families out of poverty. And who are our grants targeted at, right? They're targeted at children who cannot work. They're targeted at the elderly who cannot work. They're targeted at people living with disabilities who cannot work, right? And so the whole structure of the economy, and this is where the patriarchy comes in, the male breadwinner bias, all these fun and wonderful racial capitalism things, is just simply not working. Because you've got a whole system where men are supposed to be working, and therefore supporting all these other people in our economy. But traditionally in our country, as we know, men have been deeply underpaid, men have been deeply exploited by capitalism, and then of course women have had to subsidize this as well. So there's a whole economic reason. And so I think of social grants as a symptom of our larger issues. And until we resolve those larger issues, we cannot do without. In fact, we will have a humanitarian crisis. And in fact, it will be unconstitutional. So I think certainly sustainable, and I'd argue strongly that we need a universal basic income grant because it's just got high multipliers. And if you ask Treasury today, what are the fiscal multipliers of the social grant, they probably can't tell you because they don't know. They're just making budgetary decisions without the knowledge that they need to actually make these decisions. So very critical as well. So in terms of the claim by Tokyo, the Heritage Fund, so very interesting and dramatic story that's happening in our fall. But to say that, I won't say it's correct or incorrect, but my understanding is that the Reserve Bank cannot receive money on behalf of people. So what happens is one commercial bank A is sending money to commercial bank B. And the Reserve Bank is effectively the middleman. So Reserve Bank gets notified that Lucy is sending money to Dominic, right? But it's not that the money comes from Dominic to the Reserve Bank and then to Lucy. So that's not how it works. So I can't say whether those claims are valid or not, but I will say that the logic around the transactions directly with SARB, I don't know. I'm not really truly convinced on that part. But it's worthwhile to look at. It's worthwhile. I think it's interesting to see the moment and observe it. I said to one of my friends recently, SARB and National Treasury were able to release a statement within 24 hours around this issue. But when we ask them to extend the grants, when we ask them with economic issues, our minister tells us that we'll read about them in the Sunday paper. There's also a larger economic, political economy discussion to be had around this issue in itself. In terms of servicing debt, so I'll start with the Zimbabwe thing. I don't think the extreme case here to use is Zimbabwe. I think the extreme case here to use is Greece. That's the more appropriate country comparison. Greece implemented extreme austerity, right, and was borrowing a lot of money from the OECD and so forth, and that's how they found themselves where they were. So in terms of servicing debt, we've already said what is fundamentally needed is growth. And I actually want to say that, yes, borrowing from the IMF and the World Bank is deeply, deeply problematic. But what I want to put here is to say borrowing isn't necessarily inherently wrong, right? You can borrow and a well-spent stimulus will pay for itself back. But I'm not saying go borrow from the IMF or the World Bank. There's other ways to borrow. They're not the only lenders in the game. So it's important to acknowledge that borrowing isn't necessarily inherently wrong. Borrowing when you don't have a proper economic growth strategy is wrong, which is what's happening, right? Borrowing when you're not going to spend the money in the way that will effectively uplift your economy is wrong. And so I also thought that, I said the other day that it's funny that we're being told we've got too much debt, but I hear that National Treasury is getting a loan from the BRICS Bank or something. And I said, but I thought we had too much debt. That doesn't make sense. This again goes to this question of the logic. What logic is Treasury telling us? How are they rationalizing these things? They get to get away with it, which doesn't make sense. They get to get away with saying, we have too much debt, but we just borrowed like money from the World Bank or whoever, and we just all have to deal with it. So there's a lot of meaningful participation that has to take place in that arena, to say that how do we hold National Treasury accountable? How do we prevent them from making the wrong decisions on behalf of South Africa? Yes, it's National Treasury making that agreement with IMF or World Bank or whatever, but fundamentally, who will bear the cost? South Africans, right? So yes, I think economic growth is possible from borrowing, just not necessarily IMF or World Bank, because that's, we know their political agendas, and the fact that the whole budget was written to appease them so that we could borrow from them, right? All our budgets are written to appease credit rating agencies. Our budgets are written to appease the markets. They're not written for us. They're not written for average South Africans. So the 500 billion, so again, just to reiterate that out of that 500 billion, it was not all from National Treasury, right? 200 billion is from the South African Reserve Bank, and it's not necessarily money that was influxed into the economy. It's just to say that these businesses are taking loans from the South African Reserve Bank and won't pay them. That's 200 billion. Another 100, and then in the other amounts, the tax relief wasn't money that National Treasury spent. It was just saying, we will pay the money later. So it was businesses saying, we will pay our taxes later. So it's not money coming from National Treasury. That's another 70 billion. So now we're at 270 billion, right? Then you've got TERS. TERS is not National Treasury, right? So it's an outside of budget thing that's happening, UIF, the off budget. So if fundamentally, when you actually look at all these numbers, you'll see that Treasury only spent 45 billion new money. That was the only money that Treasury had to add to the existing budget. It was about 45 billion. And only 36 billion of that was actually to the items. So what does that mean? It means majority of what Treasury contributed was just reprioritizing the existing budget. So they moved money, they said, look, Busi was supposed to get 50 rand, but we're now gonna give this money to Dominic. Or we're gonna do that internally. But effectively, they just only increased the budget spent by 36 billion in terms of non-interest expenditure. So very important to acknowledge. So it's not that National Treasury made the resources happen. It's just, and this is the perfect example of non-orthodox tools. Why can't SARB do that? And you're right, that's a good question. Why can't SARB create credit for businesses? Why can't SARB create credit for small businesses? Why can't, we have these institutions active at various stages? It's because there was just never incentive to do so. It's because we know that the current economic thinking is anti, new ideas, so to speak, if I could put it bluntly like that, right? They're not interested in implementing unorthodox tools. They're interested in entrenching neoliberalism as they know it. They're interested in entrenching textbook economics. They're very much entrenched in this particular agenda. And so what that means is that they're just not open to it. It's not that they couldn't do it before. They could always do these things. They just don't want to. Let me just put it simply. They just don't want to. There are many other things they could be doing now. They just don't want to do them, right? That's where we are, that they don't want to. And the question is, what will it take for them to do so? And I think that certainly mass mobilization. It will take, us saying, out with this current economic agenda. We no longer want neoliberalism. We don't want it, and so forth. Then there was a question about no recovery without rescue. How does that relate to the public sector workers? So that is a very good question, because what we mean by no recovery without rescue is that our economy was damaged a lot, right? Our economy contracted by 7% last year. And the question will always be, what would have happened if the full 500 billion, even though it wasn't enough, had been utilized? What would have happened? Would we have seen the same impact? What would have happened if we had implemented more measures to rescue our economy during every wave? Remember, there were no really, like besides the extension of the special grant, there were no real measures for the second wave, right? So the way to recover, so I'm going to go back to America's Great Recession or Depression. The first thing you have to do is stabilize. So that's what we're talking about. Rescue means stabilizing, means saving jobs, means saving households, means, protecting the existing people in your economy. It's harder to revive a dead economy than to keep one alive, right? And that's what we mean by rescue. Keep it alive, at least, at the very least. We want more, of course, because then what happens is if you've rescued the economy, then you've got more room to now improve it and change it going forward. But if you destroy your economy and you go into a humanitarian crisis, then we are talking about a very different context. Then your new policy responses are going to have to then deal with what you've created, which is now this, terrible context which we didn't want to get to begin with. And so how that affects public sector wage bill is that one, as we already know, the public sector wage bill is a sort of like a scapegoat, like we've already seen, where it's being, sacrificed, right? To say that, oh, we can't afford it, and so forth. And Dominic and then we'll talk about that later. And so the no rescue, right, means our economy is going to be worse off. And if our economy is worse off, it means that public sector wage bill is at higher risk, generally, going forward, right? Because it means that it will always be used to justify austerity. It is being used to justify the economic policies. And so, I don't want to get into just a lot of politics. There's a lot of politics to be said about that. But to say that effectively the no rescue is the reason we're also in the situation that we're in, right? We're always going to be in accelerated austerity. Let's not even pretend we're never going to be here. We're always going to be here. What it's just done is justified and accelerated it further. And there was a question around, just to say on the rescue versus recovery, it's rescue is your foundation. If you don't have a solid foundation to stand on, you can't build on it. You can't build on it. If you destroy your foundation, which is what's happening, it's going to be way harder, way longer. It's going to take longer to recover than if we had done the right thing the first time. And so in terms of de-risking versus public sector, so that's my favorite question because fundamentally, economics is about resource allocation, right? That's the bottom line, main definition of economics. Resource allocation, how do we, make this work? And in economics, there's always been debates around who must provision what. Must education be private sector provisioned or must it be public sector provisioned? Does the state, and that goes to the question of what is the role of the state? Which is what I said, right? The very important question, what is the role of the state? What is the role of the state in South Africa in a constitutional democracy? To me, the fact that we have all these rights, and I'm going to tell you now, private sector is not going to provision that, right? Private sector will not provision education for all that everybody can afford. That's the reality. That's how private sector functions. They're not here for the good of the world. Business is important. Business has a role. Business will always have a role. Even in a socialist economy, you have business. Even in a communist economy, you have business. Whatever economy you want, business will exist, right? But the fundamental question is, what is the role of the state? What goods must be provisioned by the state? What goods must be provisioned by private sector? And in South Africa, we haven't, there's a lot of state provisioning, but it's important that we consolidate and say we want one education system. Like what happened to those protests back in the 90s, right? The whole idea was always to have one education system, not one where some children are getting 98% pass rates for matric and another where, the pass rate is not that, it's 64% and so forth. That's not what we wanted, right? And so it's important to then go back to these conversations about what is the desired role of the state and how do we make that happen. If you think the role of the state is minimal, like I said, then you will think that the state provisioning a universal basic income grant is impossible. You limit what the state can do if you feel like the role of the state should be small. You know, there's nothing wrong with having a large public sector wage bill, in my view. In my view. Because the question is, are South African rights being delivered on? Right? What do we need? And that's the question, like how do we link these things? What are the needs and what resources are needed to meet them? And how do we solve that? So in terms of de-risking, I think that was also a good question. So this is what's happening with de-risking. The state effectively says, and I'll use DOM as private sector. Unfortunately, DOM, you get to be the great private sector business. So I'm the state, and it's me, Busi. Dominic says to me, Busi, I want to. So I say to Dominic, South Africa needs infrastructure, right? Dominic, if you want to build Gautrain, which exists, right? If you want to build Gautrain, I will help you. I'll give you some financing to start off your project. I know that there's real risks in South Africa because sometimes people don't make the money that they expect. So what I'll do is I'll give you some financing to start off, right? And I say to Dominic, but Dominic, if your project fails, right, or there's an economic crisis, Dominic can't pay his loans anymore, I will be the last man standing for your project, meaning I will step in and pay for your shortfalls. That's what de-risking does, right? It says, I will take all the risk from this project. So Dominic, you will walk away, if you put in 500 Rand, you will walk away with 500 Rand, regardless, or more. You will get at least your 500 Rand or more, is what the state is doing. But in other countries, if you look at Portugal, there's been some really terrible examples globally of this, where me and Dominic have this agreement, and then the economy crashes next year. And let's say think about it this way, I've got 80 projects like this. How much money does the state now owe? Right? As a liability for all these projects. Now there's Dominic, there's Manbani, there's all these people. How much money do I now owe? Because now there's an economic crash that I didn't see coming. There's COVID wave 4, whatever. So now what happens is my debt to GDP is going to do what? It's going to increase, right? So to me, it's not logical to have so many public-private partnerships when a government is concerned about debt, because they don't know the future. They can't predict the risks of the future. In fact, they're adding risks to the fiscus, right? Instead of saying, guys, let's just pay it anyway. Let's just pay it. Let's just build whatever we want to build. And also the problem with these de-risking approaches is that Dominic doesn't want to invest in a rural area somewhere. Dominic wants where there's money. Because Dominic wants to build a Gautrain. He's not going to build a Gautrain in Bizana. So what happens is that he doesn't provision the infrastructure that's needed in rural areas, right? So it biases towards areas where it's profitable. That's what business does. Capitalistic business is all up in the business of profit. And that is why, it's important. And so when Tito Mboweni says we want user pay principle, it means that the projects that are going to go forward are the ones that are going to expect people to pay. And if people can't pay, like the Gautrain, then those businesses make mass losses, actually. Right? So they're actually not that sustainable in our current context. It's nice in Europe, maybe. Maybe it'll work in Europe because people there have jobs and can afford it. In South Africa, I don't think it'll work. So yeah, I think I've answered all the first round questions.
I'll take one more round and then we'll close the session. My suggestion is that after we close the session, we take lunch at 12:30 about, and then we reconvene at 1:30. I've also noted some terms that Busi used through a presentation, but also that came up in the discussion. So for example, I want to go back to terms like non-interest spending. Okay, what does that mean exactly again, right? Busi gave a definition. There was she said real terms and nominal terms. What does that mean? Yeah? There was a talk speaking about multipliers. What's a multiplier? We're not talking about the times table and division here. There's a different multiplier. And then Lucy spoke about a well-spent stimulus. What's a well-spent stimulus? No?
Yeah, well spent money.
Yeah, and then I heard Lucy spoke about TERS, and then I heard someone say, what's TERS? So we'll come back to what's TERS as well, okay? So I'm not going to ask Lucy to cover all of this because, as I was saying, she needs some time to very hard. So we'll take another round. I see Comrade Jabu, I saw Comrade Dick, and I see Comrade Name. And Comrade Name. And then we'll break.
And they must all come in front. Want to see them.
So Comrade Jabu, Dick, Nengwe, and Matonzi. No, they will close, but we'll come back. A lot of these things will be picked up again. Comrade Jabu.
Okay, no. We want to understand we as a legal people we might not understand, but you are here to assist us.
Yes.
First and foremost, we appreciate the work that you are doing and welcome it. Hopefully when I leave out here, I come back. Let me start by saying we observe that the budget of government, we only get to see it and hear about it in 1994. Prior than that, we couldn't hear because apartheid system was dealing with white only and those who are friends and close to white people. Now, we see the budget is growing. When you remember Mandela was speaking of thousands, Thabo Mbeki speak of millions, Jacob Zuma speak of trillions. Now we are of the opinion that Cyril Ramaphosa will speak of a number that we don't know yet. But very soon we heard about 15 zeros. I don't know what's the number that was said by Tom. It's 15 zeros. So you will know that now. But my question is, where is all that money coming from? The government money. We know that government collects money normally. At our face value, we know that there is money coming from tax, there's money, UIF, money from government entities such as ESCOM and others that's supposed to bring money, but that does not at this present. So, maybe my question will be, where does the source of money of government and how much can it be in that bag? If it's a bag, brown bag, they speak of black bag, but how much is there? If we can know, so that we can see these austerity measures that are coming to our side. To say, as it is given to us, but how much remaining back to the government? That's where my profession is. I wish to know that what is the source of government in terms of getting money, where the government get money from, let alone tax and others that is at our disposal, but maybe there's more that we might not know. And of course, we agree that borrowing is a problem. I listened to Thabo Mbeki to say, if a country is in debt and growing in debt, that country will be swimming in debt, of which is true if you look at a normal person being heavy on debt. But where does that money come from?
So, thanks, Comrade Jabu. D, and then
sorry.
Matonzi.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you, comrade.
Hi.
Hello. I do agree with you about the fact that education is an investment to any country. And you also highlighted that there is a decline in the allocation of education budget, which will mean also that it will have a negative impact in terms of the labor force that the education institutions are producing. So my question is, what are the strategies that the education specialists can use to prepare the current generation for the fourth industrial revolution, since we see that there is a high rate of unemployment in our country? Thank you.
Yeah, and then last meeting.
Yes, Comrade Musa, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, and you?
No, thank you. No, I'm just standing up here. I'm from TUI, Trade Union International. I'm just standing up to appreciate your education around these issues of economy. And I've noted quite a number of points. In particular, your last point when you deal with in relation to issues of triple Ps. I'm just saying that if possible, I was speaking to my teacher here. He said he's going to educate me further. We have recently dealt with the case of a triple P in Lesotho. You may have heard about it. Netcare is in a triple P partnership with the Lesotho government on an elite hospital, tertiary hospital there. And we've been warning them that triple Ps will never work, they crash. And when then, not that it was badly handled, it was consequentially going to fall anyway. It fell, and 320 nurses were laid off when they were taking action against that. So I'm happy that recently government of Lesotho on Friday came to their senses. We had written a lot of correspondence to them to then say, indeed, they are serving divorce papers with that Netcare company because it didn't work. But to me, it's not enough. We are going to write a statement to say we are happy, triple P has collapsed, but I think if there is a document that unpacks the evils within triple P agreement, because you even find our own comrades talking about triple Ps as a sort of amnesia to government taking responsibility for social functions of state. Thank you.
Last question, Comrade Lucy, and then you can make your final inputs and remarks. Dixon? Someone who you know is coming now.
More Buti.
Yeah,
So thank you very much for that presentation. Please allow me to steal from it in with that coming workshop. I will give you as a source, but it was like a primer. Now we will speak later about the intra-public sector borrowing and lending and so on. You know that I'm very much into that. It makes me crazy. But there's another thing I would like to say, and that is about how do you think that I feel that the public sector unions, even maybe the budget justice coalition, and even maybe I restrain myself on that issue, and that's the issue of taxation. And I mean, when this tax relief for the middle class and down to people who are earning 110, 120, 130,000 rand per year, which surely also affects a lot of public sector workers like nurses and so on. So people kind of get the tax relief of like 700 rand per year. So that is about 60, 70 rand per month. They get in tax relief. And then it's kind of like supported. And the effect of these tax reliefs and these tax cuts hits the public sector workers themselves, because that means that the vacancies at public sector hospitals, etc., is not filled. Yeah. And it seems to me that, I don't know, because I'm new in this country, maybe it's a heritage of the apartheid government that people are so much against taxation, which also makes us in the Budget Justice Coalition a bit silent on that issue. We like to speak about the wealth tax on kind of like, and we believe that you can hit only 50,000 people in the country or something like that. But we don't speak about taxation or as a kind of solidarity issue where we put the part of our income to the commons, to what we collectively need and so on. And I feel that I'm very frustrated that the public sector unions now is completely silent of what is going on in the negotiations also. And the issue of taxation, which will not only be on the rich, if you are going really to build a cohesive society, it will also be, well it is today also, I mean working people are also paying the VAT of course, but there must be a change in the whole narrative around taxation. But what shall we do? How shall we present it? It makes me so mad.
Before I hand over to Busi, just on Dick's point, if I can concretize it. So in this last budget, we know that Social Security, I get worried when not all comments are in the room. I'm worried, I see comments, but I'm not sure what's happening. So there's a 0.6% nominal percentage increase to the social grants, okay, over 3 years. So when we look at, so just on the real terms thing, when it's in real terms, it means you take account for the rising prices of goods and services in society, inflation, right? So when you take into the cost of inflation, in terms of the increase, the supposed increase to the grants, we see that the buying power, how much money is actually received from the grants, is going down, okay? So that's what we mean by real terms. Now there's in the previous budget, social grants declined in real terms, all right? To be able to give just a 0% real term increase, in other words, to account for inflation in grants, to keep it at the same level of inflation, would have required 4 billion rand, all right? No, just 4 billion rand increase to the grants to give everyone an inflationary increase, all right? At the same time, we saw rebates above inflationary tax increases to the personal income tax brackets for certain levels, okay? Most of it is actually from that 100,000 to 150,000 or something like that, they did. It's not the higher end where this tax bracket creep happened this time. So if you account for how much was lost as a result of the above inflationary increase to the tax band, so what that means is that if you increase the personal income tax band by more than inflation, it means that you will fall into a lower tax bracket at that level, which means you tax less for that tax for a certain amount. So the amount that's lost as a result of that is 11.2 billion rand. But then the government, that's just in the amount that we could have raised in taxes, in revenue. But then we also lose an additional 2.2 billion. So in total, it's a more than 12 billion rand lost in revenue, technically. So we could have actually, if we didn't give that above inflationary tax bracket increase to the personal income tax rate, and you made sure that the people that between 100,000 and something and 200,000, which is not a lot of money per month, they pay the same amount of taxes as they did the previous year, would have meant you could have paid the social grants 3 times over, effectively, I think. So that's just, I think, to concretize Dick's point and the point about solidarity. Lucy, I hand over to you.
Thank you. You've given me time actually to bring up this great image for the first question. Well, if I can find it now. Where is it? Okay, so thank you for the questions again, and I hope you can see the screen. So the question about where does government get money from? This is an image, it's called Public Sector Balance Sheets. It's from 2018 and was done by the World Bank, rather the International Monetary Fund. So you actually see that here, they would have placed South Africa as one of the countries with, one of the higher public sector balance sheets. So if you compare here, you've got Norway here at the end, you've got Korea there, South Africa is here, right? And what is contained in what does the government, what are our public sector balance sheets look like? What are our public assets? Is a very critical question. So there, you've got non-financial assets, right? And what does that mean? It's basically land. It's basically, I guess what you say, buildings. Our government owns a lot of buildings. The Gauteng provincial government owns a lot of buildings in CBD Joburg. You've obviously got financial assets. You've got liabilities excluding pension liabilities. Obviously, the government implement pension fund is one of the things to consider, and I know that Dick will be talking about it some more later. And you've got the, general debt. And in this public asset, debt is considered here as well, because again, debt can be, in a way, an asset, right? It's a question of how are you using that debt. I know that there was also comments about a country can't borrow from debt, but actually, basically most countries have debt. And in fact, in advanced economies, most of them have, a lot of debt, right? If you look at Japan, if you look at America, those late stage capitalistic, societies have quite a lot of debt. So again, it's this question of is debt as bad? And also remembering that Thabo Mbeki was also a deep neoliberal in his economic thinking. And so reducing debt deficits is one of the key areas of neoliberal economic policy. So yes, and also just drawing from Thomas Sankara, who would say that, debt is being used as a political tool. So not depriving it of that larger conversation to say what kind of debt. Debt in itself is not completely bad. It is about, are you able to service the debt? Who is that coming from, and what politics come with it are fundamental issues that we have to think about. Because I would be okay with South Africa having a lot of debt, but also growing and meeting the needs of the people and meeting constitutional obligations and doing what we've been asking the government to do for a long time. I'd be okay with that, right? As long as we could service our debt, as long as our economy is growing, and not growing just for growth's sake, but growing in a way that is just, right? Because we don't want growth that is going to harm us, like growth that is climate damaging. We don't want growth that is entrenching or reproducing gendered inequalities. That's not the type of growth we want. It's what type of growth we want. So I'm okay with borrowing if it is producing the type of growth that we want, right? And obviously we have to collectively decide what is this. I want, personally, the type of growth that challenges racial capitalism and patriarchy. I don't know about what kind of growth other people want, and that might look different, but that's sort of a collective vision we have to make, to say, this is the kind of growth we want. But yeah, I just wanted to bring this up, and of course, this you can find, I don't know how I can say all of this, but it's called the Fiscal Monitor. So if you look at the International Monetary Fund Fiscal Monitor, you will get this graph. South Africa, effectively, if this is a resource that you'd like to look at. And in terms of, which brings me to the,
Perhaps you can send me the PDF of it, or the link. I'm going to put up a Google folder with all the resources, and if you send your presentation as well, I can put that in there too. So, if you don't mind, for people to
Perfect. No, I'll do that. I'll just add the picture to the presentation then somewhere. Somewhere within the presentation with the link and everything. So what the government has is a very complex thing, including debt, right? Including government debt is one of the things we have in our bag, if you think of it that way. And in terms of, I'll come to this de-risking and then I'll come back to the two last issues. In terms of de-risking paper, my colleague Sonia Paladze, she's written on, PPPs. So if you go to the IHA website, and I can also send the link to Dominic, you will find a paper that's been published. It's called, I'm trying to think of the name now, but it's effectively on infrastructure. It's about the infrastructure plan. So Sonia Paladze has written about that. And so those ideas actually that I've presented are actually her research that she's conducted on behalf of the IJ for that. And so I hope it's a very clear paper, I think. She outlines a lot of things, which are also some of them I don't even know as an economist, but that's her specialty. So we can't be, a specialist in everything, I suppose. But it's a worthwhile paper to look at, very good paper. In terms of strategies for educators, so this is another question that I enjoy a lot because I think it's tricky. In South Africa, we've been very interested in supply side economics, and when I talk about supply side, I'm talking about how do we train workers, how do we, create the right environment, how do we, and so forth, but haven't really focused on demand, right? Because you can create as many skilled workers as you want, but if there's no demand for those workers, if those skills are not linked to some sort of market desire, right, then those people are not necessarily going to be employed in those sectors. So I think, I know it's the question about what can educators themselves do, but I think it's even a larger issue, which is what is the Department of Labor doing? What kind of work are we doing at a national level to say, we want an economy that is green, that is purple, and by purple I mean care economy kind of like work. And we want an economy that looks like this. And what skills do we need? And therefore, how do we develop those skills from the ground up? Right? So there isn't sufficient planning in our economy. That's what we're actually missing. Planning, coordinated planning, demand side, supply side, labor policies, sectoral policies. How do these policies speak to each other? How does our current education system reflect the master plans that are currently being developed in NEDLAC? Do you see what I mean? So actually, I know that it's more of a personal what can you do, but just to say, to contextualize it within the greater issue of economic planning, the NDP is not a plan, right? So I think we just, I've been researching this, and there's very interesting research around like commissions and so forth, and when they work and they don't work. But the thing is, commissions that coordinate this kind of growth. Ethiopia did a very good one. Japan also had a very good economic planning board. But the problem is they have to be instituted by people with power. They must have power. You can't have a commission that does not have power. That's the only time commissions work. Coordinating commissions work. Like right now, the National Planning Board, do they have power? And that's the thing, right? It's also a question of power. But I think educators, there's a great report around sort of the skills for the future. I think that's one thing that educators, and obviously acknowledging that with educators, you've got a set syllabus that you have to teach, and that's what you have to teach for your students to pass. But also just being aware of sort of like, what are the skills of the future? What is needed? What are the competencies? I would actually say it's not necessarily, it's skill sets. I once asked one of my managers back in the day, she said, well, not that long ago, but back in the day, like 3 years ago. And she said to me, if I were to be a student now, I said, what would you study for the future? And she said I'll study math because I don't know what the future holds. I think it's important to acknowledge that most of the jobs that will exist in a number of years don't exist yet. So the question should be a focus on skills as opposed to like professions is also another key thing. So when your students are going to university, are there jobs for economists? I can tell you this personally as once a job seeker myself. There aren't many economist jobs. It sounds like a great profession, You know what I mean? I mean, it is a great profession, but there aren't many economist jobs. That's also just the reality. It sounds nice, you study it and you know, you get the skill set, but getting a job in economics, especially progressive economics, is very difficult and very few opportunities there. So yeah, it's tricky. And I also just saw the South African Accounting Board results. I don't know if anybody else has seen them. Did you see that the pass rates for black women is 23%, black men 24%, right? Like those are things we must be like conscious of, uh, helping our students navigate. I've got here, my little brothers are both in grade 11 now. So that's a question, I mean, if you want to explore it further and if you've got answers, I'm keen to hear them because that's a question I think about every day. Like, what are they going to become when they grow up? Like, oh my gosh, it's so stressful. But something we should look at. But yeah, just to contextualize it within the larger issue. And in question of like taxes and solidarity issues, I think yeah, Dominic and Dick started talking about this quite a bit, and I think that's a very important point around solidarity taxation. I think in South Africa, though, and I want to historicize it as well. I always think every economic question should be historicized, always, economically, socially, contextualized. Why part of the problem is that, and I think obviously one, there's low tax morale. Because of course, you know, we hear every day, I think there's a corruption scandal every day, there's a, you know, whatever you want to hear. So there's deep distrust in the system itself, right? And when we think about the fiscal contract, what kind of fiscal contract does South Africa have? You know, is it one where Busi's like, take all my money, I'm okay with you taking it all because I know that if you take X amount of my salary, these amount of people will go to bed, you know, fed and full and fine, you know, and I think that many people would put up their hand and say, I'm okay with that, if we trusted the states to do what it says it does. But I think in terms of historical terms, there's, you know, I don't know if you know Ayabo Matawe, but he's publishing a book soon. And in that book, one of the things he discusses is effectively this idea of part of this tax issue, if you look at the apartheid times, someone mentioned we now see the budget post-apartheid times, was this issue of that black people were overtaxed, right? And they didn't get the benefits. Black people were subsidizing the white system so much, right? Through taxation, through low wages, which are two things, right? The combination of low wages and overly taxed without rewards, right? Is a historical issue that in whatever we think about solidarity now has to be tackled and explored further, right? What are the gender tax implications is another thing that we don't talk a lot about. I don't think there's enough studies in South Africa that say, I mean, you know, when they said the alcohol tax, whatever, what they call it, alcohol, yeah, that one, it's gonna go up. I know the special word, it's not tax. But when they said the alcohol tax is gonna go up, I said patriarchal households where there's a male breadwinner who drinks are going to be impacted more. That's a gender issue. Yeah. Because what if the male breadwinner is drinking more, it means there's less disposable income for everyone in that household, right? So I think in terms of tax, there's certainly room to make it inclusive, but it has to be linked to this issue of a fiscal contract with the state. It has to be linked to how do we develop trust. It has to be linked with how do we think about SARS capacity. It has to be linked with perceptions of tax. It's a big one that you're raising there, perceptions of tax. And in fact, I just wrapped up a project when we looked at a case in Nigeria where they had started taxing the informal sector in a market setting. So here's a market, and they were taxing the informal sector workers there. But the reason why in the two states where it was successful it worked is because they developed tax to service agreements with their local governments. So the people who work in those markets said, we are okay with paying tax, right? But this is what we want in return. We want functioning toilets, we want stalls that are blah, blah, blah. we want security, we want X, Y, and Z. And so that was text to service agreement that was signed at a local level. And I think maybe in South Africa, something we could think about, how do we have text to service agreements at municipal levels? How do we think about, because again, remembering, I showed earlier a graph of what we have in our bag, but actually what it doesn't show is how much money we accumulate at a municipal level and a provincial, like, because there's obviously different gradings, right? Because municipals make money from property taxes and so forth and so forth. So it's complicated. But just to say, how do we think differently about the fiscal contract, I suppose is my best answer for you. And I don't have the answers, unfortunately, but I've got some, things we can start to think about and explore that further. So I think I've answered all the questions, and thank you for all your wonderful questions and listening to my random musings. Some of my answers are just my things that I think about randomly and read about. So I'm glad somebody wants to listen to these random musings. But thank you so much.
Lucy, I don't think we can thank you enough for your time, for your reflections and perspectives. I think your random musings, or what you call random musings, will really deepen a lot of our perspectives and thoughts here, and it really takes our workshop forward in a meaningful way. So thank you so much, Lucy. Really appreciate it from all of us. And I know from here, many of the comrades are incredibly impressed by the many bars you've dropped here today. So hopefully you will have some time to relax and look forward to engaging with you further. Thanks so much.
No time to relax. Today I'm writing feminist macroeconomics. We have to keep that on.
No race. Thanks, Musi. Take care.
And where's Musi coming
Bye.
Correct. Before we leave, it's about, I think it's almost 10 to. So it's 10 to. So let's reconvene at 10 to 1 sharp, please. Comrade Tanami. 10 to 2. Sorry. Yeah. And the Google Drive can be circulated. I think we should edit the day from this. We should edit the recording so that it's not the whole thing. I saw it's going to be the whole thing at once. I think it's easy to do that if you want. That you just. Okay. So we're not going to have a recording of tomorrow.
You can still have it today.
I mean,
I can show you how to do it. Because this thing is
thanks, comrade. Okay. So then what you'll do is you'll take it into the sessions. You'll make session 1, solar, the recording. Session 2, we'll see recording session.
But it's still here, the whole day.
Yeah, but I think as long as we have
I need to meet this lady.
This one.
Hello.
See you.
Hello.
Yeah, man, clean this up. I think we're doing very well. I think we're doing very well.
No, we're doing very well. And with the gentlemen, so bisa ulandu kustirman. Ubustirman.
What's enough?
Ubustirman. Esethu.
Please, John.
Dominic, these are coming from Bloemfontein. Yeah, if you know yala talk and typing. Yes, So
It's a live feed.
Yeah, it's a live feed.
Everyone in the country can see this.
Yeah. But izani masenze kule yam ngizambonisa kule yam. You're right because abamazo Apple.
Hayi man.
Izani madoda abasibari.
Thank you, Baba. Sure.
Student right now.
Yabona this session with the ntombazana.
Yeah.
So
Le ndoba leyo ukuthi ngizosindisha ngamaphaqaphaqa ayikho leyo. Benditsho nje le ndoba leyo ukuthi siza lalelane ngixoxa lohahala uyolibetha ufake ku-NEC ku-NOB athi all those who have attended conference abagqokanga izinto zesalipsi defined. Angazi libonile.
This is a mini workshop for all the.
Usho kanjalo manje upresident ethethile.
This is a mini workshop. Comrade Esethu Stofile now ndihamba nosonamzi babonisa how to talk and type.
This is Free State.
Free State. No how to nangiya.
So you don't want to facilitate?
No, we facilitate ndihamba.
Facilitate
Akunike ngathi ndiyaba-impose.
So ufuna bayibone even from an office because they might think because it's me.
No.
I need to send them a step. I'll give him time. He's here with us.
He's here with all of my kids.
So simple.
Yeah.
Connect. No, I can use mine, but I don't want to use mine because I don't want to think like anything special. Yes, what I want to do is I want to show you how to speak and your machine types. So, we can go to WhatsApp. And then you can just choose any contact, anyone that you want to
Contact. It didn't choose the family. Let's choose
So now all you do is you click where you are going to be typing.
Okay.
And then you see there is a button here.
Okay.
You click on this button.
Which one?
Okay. It's the wrong one. This one is not this one.
Oh, this one. Okay.
This is the one in the bottom. Click on leave. Say enable detection.
All right.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is John, and I like to party. So now, what it does is everything that I say, it rewrites it so that I don't need to type it. So whether you are going to be sending a WhatsApp message, whether you are going to be typing on a Word document, whether you are sending an email, whatever you want to be doing, you don't always have to type. Even when it comes to minutes down. For as long as you have a device, you can just use this feature to just
then put it there because automatically, if we are in a meeting, it means it can be able to record all the conversation we are speaking in the lobby. Thereafter, then I can send it to him. Then now we have then we have the whole meeting.
Absolutely. And on this one, let me just
Bye. We will be having NOP meeting. We will be having NOP meeting on Monday every day. On Monday, so that is
Hey, good morning.
That will be
You have data on your phone.
I will be meeting on Monday, every day on Monday. It is that is the day. So Esethu Stofile, Esethu Stofile minutes take it.
You make a
I
chapter,
don't
yeah.
know my day and I use my
So you
present.
teach us,
Yes.
yeah.
Finish. She had a little compromise.
Ah, it's going to be keep a guy.
I didn't say we discuss.
Ah, uzobethe uyandifaka ngithi
awungenwe awuyi pa mara khona wena udlala esikolana wamwalisa ushapile esikolana mthabolwena lubili bethile esikolana
Well, this one is not in line with the technology.
I think just download a new check here called we can go there so long. I'll do this as I'm walking.
Oh, yo, libele, yes. Thanks for talking. Woman. Even those of you apparently cool.
all the way power.
Sure.
Leave the phone here. I'm gonna lock after this. You're gonna lock because now I'm still gonna refresh for you when you come in and need to do the system. So maybe there's nothing. Or you charge it any one that is gonna not plug in. No, you can charge it. It's the way it goes.
why. Native debt now is coming
Sure.
at 7% now. Thanks, man.
Okay.
Jackson, you could not hear, just see that it's locked with all those laptops here. Why is it making so hot? Making so hot? Oh my word.
It's not like the old time.
Oh.
I just put it, they just pick up the temperature because there was a lot of people.
So,
I don't want.
don't forget to first do the stick the dress up. And 9 cheese. But the coffee, I'm going to show you. The coffee, everything must go up and the 9 cups. Tea break is going to be there. And I'm going to take the cake up and the flowers.
Where the fuck the people they want to be on top?
You don't know inside, you must wait. Yeah.
Yeah.
you're able to follow.
The following is not the issue. The issue is, why does it have to be an event like today? And then what happens after today? When do you speak about this thing again? And to what extent is there going to be any form of action? How do you get started? With whom do you start? Because it's easy to talk about challenges and talk about realities and so forth. Most difficult thing is, so what? Because been there for the longest of time, things are just possibly getting worse. So what? If you're not doing anything about it and you're just talking about it,
I agree.
what's the point?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what I can say is from our side, all we can do is try and motivate people to do stuff. By
Yes.
giving them the information.
Yeah.
That's our hope. More than that, we can't really do much. But
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Reporting live from AIDC. Stop. Yes. Now, where is this video sitting now? Videos. Let's do this again. Uthina bako
Thatha ndayela ne.
usho siqale kaze mhlawumbe ngobeke.
Faka oyifakayo.
Faka ondamasi.
Ondamasi.
Kahle.
Hayi. Awumkhaphuzi fani zabo.
Andiva?
Umkhaphuzi bakuthi.
Oh, ngomkhaphuzi.
Umkhaphuzi.
Umgquba akakunikiseli. Umgquba awukanikiseli.
Ngalukisela umgquba.
Eyo.
Ngalukisela umgquba.
Okanye usachipile wena. Okanye usachipile.
Hayi ndathipanga lokho ngiyazi. Ndathipanga ngiyakhathazeka nangoku.
Masambe kaloku.
Ndavuma into erongo.
Iyakuchana ngoku.
Endawo ngisebenza kuyo nawuza. Hayi shem. Ayondawo.
Kodwa kwamlungu nyani.
Kwamlungu. Ayondawo. Awuna holiday yapha because usoloko busy, yebo?
Hayo. Funeka madoda icebo libe khona. Masibuyelele emva. Mhlawumbi ngakhona loo nto ikhoyo phaa kwelaa cala. Kakhulu.
Ukhala kwam kulomsi.
Hayi, nanolunga. Ndithi ndikhala kulo wam mna ndiphangela. Bona ndiphangela twice ofisini, 3 times ndiphangelele endlini.
Kodwa yakhala.
Ndiyakhala.
Wena anikhali nje ngathi mse. Ngoba impela nyanga wena uyayibona into ephangelelayo.
Ewe.
Wena
Hayi
Yes.
The OSD, it's the occupation, the special, what's it, the OSD again?
Oh my goodness.
Let me go back to my notes.
Occupation specific dispensation. Isho i-wallet sayisebenzisa thina. Oh, hayi. Sifuna imali thina i-license samnika.
ayifani ezinye ihotela.
But i-popular le hotel yakho.
Kodwa wathatha abafana basemzimkhoma bahlala apha.
Kunjalo.
Uzathetha ukuthini loo nto?
Kaloku kunjalo.
Wabahlalisa abasebenzi apha?
Kaloku.
Ubahlalisa apha? Uthetha ukuthini la? Wena ke xa uzawuthi wena ufuna wena mhlawumbi waselokishini. Elokishini. Uzazikhwelela usemsebenzini
Uzibhatalele.
uzibhatalele.
Angakunikela imali yoba uzawuhlala apha nje na.
Hayi bo. Uthi nazi isiphi zininzi pha.
Ufuna ukubonisa uba akacingi nokucinga.
Uzaxelela bona lo wenza isule zityo. Angamthatha naseCrossing ovelatsho. Umuntu uzawusula iglasi mana konke uyifundela ukwenza le nto. Utsho kanjalo.
Ibe yintoni ke ngomuntu ke xa uzawuthetha khona.
Wathatha abafana bonke
kuba balula bona bayacenga balapha.
amaXhosa apha era mathathu okanye mabini. Sibangaphi singamaXhosa sibahlanu.
Yilo lokhu ninkaniza.
Sibahlanu singamaXhosa. Ucacile isithando baje kubuya siyavuma thina. Amadoda amka ayingavuma.
But ke uzawuhamba uye uthi
yabo. Xa kusuka kwajamba. Nakuze awuhayi, yebo. Nyamezele nje ukuba hey wena sazibophelela samusapho sathini kubona ikole nenasapho ndihlala letho sekudala iyeka mntu
hayi ndingafa
sekudala iyeka nditsho ke napha enkosazini ndithi hey yabo ungekho abantwana bengekho asuka
bozavele wenze nje unothanda
benzawuhlala apha endlini iyeke umsebenzi zawufumana umsebenzi yazi xa uhlala wedwa
fine because awuna pressure uhlala unamtyayo ke lo xesha
yabo yho sekudala ndayeka yho akunzima namanje ndahlala apho omabili ashawashapha wabhatala irenti
so wena ukwazi uhlala apha wena
andifuni iqale ngale lockdown into bahlalisa apho yabo bavalela apho bangaphumi
kodwa uyakwazi uza nefamily yakho bahlale
awukwazi ifamily yakho ke uhlala wedwa bathi uhlala wedwa kodwa kule lockdown beyivumela ukuba mbezela nabafazi babo
usencane ngapha
sinyamezele nje kungenothini yabo iholiday yazibhadala kulo mzi nami uyafika kulo mzi
anibhatalwe ngeholiday
azibhadala
ngoba kutheni
azibhadala cawa azibhadala
so kufuneka uphangele ngecawa ungabhatalwa ngayo
uphangela kwaye okoko nangeholiday nangentoni siyaphangela nje akubhatala zonke iziholiday bezikhona ndiziphangele kanti bona ndibhatalwanga zonke iziholiday nazicawe ndibhatalanga loo nto yho nzima hayi apha ndingenothini
masithembe oomalema bazakwazi usinceda because ngathi oomalema bamanyelwa apha emzantsi abantu abakwazi uvele bangene kakhulu
uyabona into enokwenzeka
apha kuthi le nkampani bendakuyo umntwana eyi-one aveze ayazi noba seligqoshiwe.
Kuthe naba besebephumile bangasikuveze bona, kuvele bona nje. At least niyazi ikhosi eriskini.
Engabaphume kaloku bona umuntu uphuma lama sithi umsebenzi abaphumi ngokuthi yabo uphuma ngokufumana umsebenzi kade asiwayo ndawo lena manje.
And akanoriskeka ona lo msebenzi omtsha.
Uyabo sawuhlala kabuhlungu ubomi bethu bonke abekho emhlabeni.
Stop it,